Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. The museum is the national home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who have served in it. There are many ways to support the museum. You can buy a book in our shop, visit the cafe, donate or become a member where you can get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Coming in, you heard the song La Mer by Charles Trenet, a favourite song of the subject of today's talk, Rena Stewart. So today I'm delighted to welcome Victoria Walsh. Victoria is a writer with a passion for people's stories. A linguist and communications professional by background, Victoria has always enjoyed writing, engaging with people from all walks of life. The Story of Rena Stewart is her second biography, and today is the release day. You cannot get it anywhere else apart from here today. And here today, you can get it signed by Victoria Walsh, author extraordinaire. So after this talk, I'll be whisking Victoria up to the shop where she will be signing copies of the brand new book. So today, Victoria will introduce the fascinating story of Rena Stewart, from Bletchley Park to translator of Hitler's will and then BBC pioneer. There will be time for questions at the end of today's talk, both online and in person. For our online audience, you can post the questions in the Q&A chat bar, and those will be put to our speaker at the end. In the audience, I'll be coming around the mic, so just raise your hand and you can put your question to Victoria. Moving on with some technical points, should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us while we work to rectify them. Online, if your stream freezes, we suggest that you click the refresh button at the top of your browser. That usually cures all ills. A member of our team will be active in the chat bar to assist you should you have any issues or queries. With that all said, I will now pass over to Victoria, and I hope you enjoy today's talk.
Thank you very much, and welcome to everyone who's dialing in online. I hear from all over the world. It's very exciting. So today I would like to tell you a story. 2 years ago, I made, rather unexpectedly, an unusual new friend. Now, the fact that Rena Stewart was 100 years old was actually only one of the things that made her rather unusual. First of all, she was a Bletchley Park girl. And if she had only been a Bletchley Park girl, that might have been quite a good story already. But the thing is that for Rena, Bletchley Park was just the start. Because after that, she went on to do all sorts of other things, including translating Hitler's will and blazing a trail for female journalists at the BBC World Service. But Rena wasn't a bigwig at Bletchley Park, nor a codebreaker. Nevertheless, I think she was quite special. How many men, let alone women, have reached 100 years old, having had a distinguished career, played a part in several episodes of global history, and also had a ball at every step of the way? What a woman she was, and what a privilege it was to meet her. 2 years on, I'm delighted to be launching her biography here today at the National Army Museum. I brought copies along with me, as Amy said, hot off the press, and they're available to those in the room to snap up afterwards. But where to start with the tale of a woman who lived life to the max for a whole century? I could go about this chronologically and just said what she did between 1923 and 2023, but that might be a little bit boring. So instead, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to tell some of Rena's story through the lens of how I pieced it together. There was a little bit of sleuthing involved. You see, this has been the most fun and fascinating project that I've ever worked on in my life, and I'm quite excited to tell you about it. And then the second thing I'm going to do is tell you the big story within the story, which is the terrific tale of Hitler's two wills. Among other things, this involves a seaplane, a yacht, a midnight raid, and all sorts more. So there's a bit of drama coming. But for now, I'm going to skip to how I met lovely Rena, just in the nick of time. It all started with a phone call. 2 years ago, I had a phone call with a family friend, Jan Harrison, and mentioned to her how much I love to write. And so she said to me, here she is, She's also in the audience today. She said to me, well, in that case, you must come and meet my next door neighbour, Rena Stewart. She's 100 years old. She was a Bletchley Park girl, and she's just starting to lose her memory, but she hasn't really told her story, and she's very keen to talk. Now, I didn't need any persuading because I love all things World War II history, and I love people's personal stories. And I also realise how important it is to get some of these stories down on paper before it's too late. But because of Rena's age and failing memory, I treated this opportunity as a race against time right from the beginning. I just thought I would have more time with her. But anyway, at that early stage, I hadn't yet planned to write a book. All I was going to do was go and meet her, talk to her, and then write up a few pages as a nice memento for her. Nevertheless, I was keen to do my homework before our first meeting. The trouble is, when somebody is 100 years old and not yet famous, there's not really much to find out about them. Luckily, Jan helped fill me in with a few details, and I also found a very helpful article online by a former colleague and World Service journalist, Andrew Whitehead. So, by the time I went to meet Rena in Ealing, I did have the basics of her story. Even so, I thought, I've got a bit of a challenge on my hands. In my mind, I had an image of a partially completed jigsaw or collage, and I thought, gosh, I've got some gaps to fill. But I'll tell you now what I found out about this splendid centenarian before I went to Ealing, as if you were about to meet her too. So, Rena Stewart was born in 1923 in the village of London Links in Fife, Scotland. She went to university at St Andrews University to study French and German, like me. And this all took place during the first years of World War II. But immediately on graduation, she and her friend Agnes decided to sign up for war service. And they joined the ATS, or the Auxiliary Territorial Service, basically the Women's Army. To begin with, they were sent on several courses, learning the basics such as how to salute, all that sort of thing, but then also some more specialised training in touch typing and recognising various German military ranks. And then finally, they were asked to sign the Official Secrets Act, and with that, they were ready. And so in early 1944, they arrived at Bletchley Park. And Rena was assigned to a department that's little known of, but was called the German Book Room. There, she worked in German on secret German military messages. These had been decrypted from the Morse code and were delivered to her on strips of paper. Her job was to check them over, make educated guesses about any gaps, and then hand them on to be made into books, which would be used by the intelligence services. And that's why it was called the German Book Room. It was actually very hard work, often quite stressful, and mainly pretty boring, to be honest, but Rena knew that it was important to the outcome of the war. And right from the word go, Rena and her friends basically had the importance of extreme secrecy drummed into them. She even had nightmares about letting the secrets out. But to Rena, being at Bletchley Park didn't quite feel like being in the army, and she described the atmosphere there as rather free and easy. Military discipline was lax, and actually nobody really saluted anyone at the park, except when a senior officer came along and then, really had to. But the main thing was that Rena said that she'd had a great time at Bletchley Park. There was a fantastic social life, and she made lots of friends. She and her girlfriends lived in a camp. They played tennis, they did Scottish dancing and amateur dramatics and so on. So, pretty good fun in the end. Nevertheless, they all did wish for the end of the war. But when it did arrive, they had a bit of a shock because the girls were told that they hadn't actually served long enough to be demobilised. So instead, they got sent over to Germany with the Intelligence Corps. And they were to work at an interrogation centre that was housed in an old spa called Bad Nendorf, near Hanover. Their job there would be to translate the statements of captured Nazi officers. So this was really quite serious work, I guess, in the run-up to the Nuremberg trials, and sometimes quite upsetting. Rena herself didn't actually interact with the prisoners, except for once. One of her interrogator colleagues had a prisoner whom he thought was a fantasist. And in spite of this, the man was going to be convicted and could possibly face the death penalty. And so on that day, Rena took the interrogator took Rena with him because he thought that Rena's presence might prevent him from bursting into tears. But sadly, it didn't. Anyway, at Bletchley Park, Rena shared an office with a Bletchley Park friend. Sorry, about Bad Nendorf, apologies. Rena shared an office with a Bletchley Park friend called Marjorie Forbes. And one day, as they were working away in the office, their boss, a Major Bill Orton, came in looking rather serious, and he had with him some papers. It was an extra top-secret task, which turned out to be translating Hitler's will. They took great care over the work, consulting every dictionary they had, and didn't tell a soul, nor did they know what happened to their work until 1947, when a book was published called The Last Days of Hitler by Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, Rena heard about this and rushed out to buy a copy, and she was delighted to find within it her and Marjorie's translation. Now, she knew that other translations had actually been done, but she felt quietly proud, I think, that theirs could be considered the definitive version. Now, although the war was over, Germany was quite a scary place at first. It had been ruined by all the bombing, and poverty and criminality were on the rise, and there were also genuine fears that the Nazis might try to take back power. In spite of this, Rena eventually managed to have quite a nice time out there. But for her, the war was actually a bit of a distraction, because what she had always wanted to do was to work in the news. So when she left left Germany, in December 1946, she went to London with her knapsack on her back and started hunting for a job in the media. But it was quite difficult for a few reasons. One of these was that she couldn't talk about her secret wartime work experience, and the other was that all the civilians had a head start on her. But eventually she did manage to find a position at the BBC World Service, albeit as a lowly clerk. Now, this was beneath her abilities, but it got her in and able to apply for more suitable roles, and she worked her way up from there over a 36-year career. Eventually, in the 1960s, as you can tell from her get-up here, she did secure a role in the newsroom, and she became the first female leader there, first senior duty editor. So Rena was a dedicated career woman with an ongoing busy social life, and it was for this reason that she never married nor had children. She didn't have time, really. But later in life, she did go back and visit Bletchley Park quite often. She started going in the 1990s when some volunteers were turning the site into a museum, and she led some early tours. I think she learned a lot at the time because there was a lot she didn't know when she was working there. And she went back several times also as a veteran guest. Here she is at the Codebreakers wall, proudly pointing at her named brick. So yes, I had a good start at the story of Rena Stewart, but I realised there was a lot of missing information on whole periods of her life, and there was a lot of detail and colour to sort of fill in, I guess. I had so many questions, but I thought I'd better approach this carefully because of her age. I'll admit I was dying to ask her about Bletchley Park and Hitler's will, but I thought it best to try and focus on the other periods of her life where I had less information. But to be honest, we did end up talking about the war. It was very hard to avoid. So here we are in June 2023, when I headed over to Ealing, very excited to meet this venerable veteran. At 100 years old, she was still living in her own home, albeit with a carer, and her elderly cat, Judy. Physically, she wasn't at her best, but mentally, I thought she was totally with it. Although she didn't remember everything, I thought her memory was incredible. And ever the keen journalist, she had the newspapers by her side, and it appeared that she had read them from cover to cover. Also, that day, we were in the middle of a heat wave, and I was a bit worried about tiring her out, but nope, she had amazing stamina as well, and she kept saying that she was happy to blether about herself. Blether being a good Scottish word I wasn't yet aware of, really, and I'd learn a few from her. But indeed, we did blether for a whole 2 hours, and it was lovely, and I found out all sorts of extra information about her life. So first of all, I found out something about the long-ago lives of her parents' generation and how they were impacted by the First World War. In the photograph here, we have Rena's mother, third from right, and her 8 sisters. There was also one brother. I think he must have taken the photograph. Several among these ladies were some women who were unkindly called the 2 million surplus women of World War I, women who couldn't find husbands, which back then was very important. I also heard about her parents' honeymoon to the beautiful valley of Glen Lyon. Now, this wasn't like a modern honeymoon. What it involved was catching a lift up the glen with a mail van a bit like this, and then, because there wasn't a lift back down again, walking back down, a bit like the grand old Duke of York. But they stopped at every house on the way so that Mr. Stewart could introduce his wife. And this is where I learnt my second Scots word, strúpach. I hope I pronounced that okay. Because at every house they stopped for strúpach, which was a light bite to eat and a cup of tea. And Rena told me that by the end of all this, her dad had eaten nine boiled eggs and her mum had had 7. Anyway, a few years later, Rena and her sister Isabel came along. Rena told me about her happy and very musical childhood in London Links and spending holidays at the family cottage in Glen Lyon. She excelled at school, which seems to be a common factor among the Bletchley Park girls, and she loved poetry. And it was this love of poetry that made her decide to study languages at university. She thought that this would give her access to a whole new world, and it certainly did. So off she went to St Andrews, which she described as a fabulous place to study, even during a war. She very magnanimously volunteered to help with wartime shortages of staff and also to clear up bomb damage. But she still managed to have a ball again in her spare time, Scottish dancing, golfing, dating, and so on. And she had so much fun that when she finally took her finals, her mother asked how they'd gone, and she said, "I don't know and I don't care. I've just had 3 of the happiest years of my life there." So then she told me some more about her time at Bletchley Park. And these are some of the messages, a bit like she would have received as she worked. She told me about the German book room, which was a big room where 40 women toiled away at their typewriters in shifts. She told me about the camp that they lived in, Shenley Road Military Camp, which she described as awful and Spartan and freezing. And they were ruled over by a female would-be dictator called Senior Commander Kemp, whose main job seemed to be preventing the girls from having any kind of fun. But fun they did have, because they went on all sorts of trips out to the cinema, hitchhiking to London, and all sorts, really. She did tell me a little bit about relationships, although she was quite a private person, but she did say that about Bletchley Park, there was a man. He was quite keen on getting married, but I was too ambitious. I thought I could do rather better in the newsroom than as a housewife. In the 40s and 50s, it was dreadful being a housewife, so I broke it off. Rena then tried to fill in some details about her time at the BBC, which she found a little bit hard because her memory on that part of her life was not so strong. But she talked about the 10 years that she spent working at the Caversham Park monitoring station near Reading. Now, I'd never heard of this, but I understand that it was essentially a listening operation run jointly by the BBC and the Foreign Office between 1943 and 2018. Rena's job there was to listen in to Russian Cold War broadcasts, which were made in English. And then relevant information would be sent off to the British and American intelligence services. The Americans actually had an office upstairs, which Rena described as hush-hush. So you could say she became a bit of a journalist spy. She enjoyed her time at Caversham Park, but always felt that it wasn't quite proper journalism. What she really wanted to do was to get into the newsroom. So off she went in the early 60s down to Bush House in London. She spoke about her time there, including as the first female senior duty editor. She described how on the night shift, the senior duty editor was the most senior person in the building and would decide which stories would lead the bulletin. It was a dream job for her. She also had to deal with all sorts of challenges, from IRA bomb threats to workplace sexism. She didn't say which of these was worse, but she said there was this idea that you couldn't have a woman writing about disasters, earthquakes, etc. What rubbish. And she told me very confidently that she had conquered that workplace sexism. Good on you, Rena. She also spoke about her long retirement between 1983 and 2023, which gave her plenty of time to indulge her love of travel and the arts. Among other things, she taught Scottish dancing until she was 90 years old and had to be persuaded to give up. Then her thoughts turned back to Bletchley Park, and she told me some stories specifically about medals and Middleton. These were two anecdotes which made her a little bit grumpy but made me laugh. The first one was about the medals pictured here, which Gordon Brown belatedly awarded to Bletchley Park veterans in 2009. Rena said, "It thoroughly annoys me." And one of the reasons for this was that on the back of the Bletchley Park medal, the middle one here, it says, "We also served." She said, "What's the also for?" "Of course we served. What did they think we were doing?" So, yes, she was a bit grumpy about that, but I totally understood why. And the second story was about a formal visit by Kate Middleton to Bletchley Park, where she chaired a panel of 4 female veterans. I thought, gosh, this is going to be a lovely story. But no, she was annoyed again. Not with Kate, it wasn't Kate's fault, but with one of the other veterans who got a little bit overexcited and would not stop talking. Poor Rena couldn't get a word in edgeways. "Well," she said, "that was a waste of time." And then finally, she spoke very fondly of her 100th birthday party and of the letter that she received from King Charles. I asked her what she was most proud of in her long and very busy life, half expecting it to be something to do with Bletchley Park or Hitler's will, but no, it was getting the job as the first female SDE. She said, "My greatest achievement has been getting people to recognise that a woman can be as good a journalist as a man." And I thought, right, I better get on with making that happen. And I was compelled to say to her, "Rena, are you a feminist?" And she said with no hesitation, but with lots of gusto, "Yes, I am." And I thought, wow, 100 years old, she's still feisty. So with all this information buzzing away in my mind, I went home to start writing. I wrote in the first person, so it's a bit like Rena's telling you her story herself. I tried to capture her way of speaking and her mannerisms. But simultaneously, I carried on doing my research and adding to it because it was so very interesting. And soon it was certainly more than a few pages. And I stopped and thought, gosh, this could be a book. A short book maybe, but certainly something more substantial than I'd first imagined. Still, there were lots of gaps in the story, so I thought, well, I better go back to Rena for round 2, and also to receive her blessing for the book. And so I went back to Ealing again, got her blessing, thankfully, and I had a few more questions for her. One of these was a burning question. You see, during my research, I thought I had uncovered some big secret, and I needed to check with Rena. When I finished writing the first draft of what I called at that point the booklet, I went through checking historical details. And when it came to look up Rena's boss in Germany, Major Bill Orton from the Intelligence Corps, I couldn't find anything, and certainly no photographs. And I thought, that's odd. But I know somebody in the Intelligence Corps, so I'll ask her. Meanwhile, I had a second person to look up, and that was Major Hugh Trevor Roper, an Oxford historian and Intelligence Corps officer, and the same person that wrote The Last Days of Hitler. At the end of the war, and this is a very little-known story, Trevor Roper received 2 special missions. The first of these was to find out what had happened to Hitler, and the second was to track down his 2 wills. So I consulted my friend Wikipedia, and halfway down the page on Hugh Trevor Roper, I found something rather strange. It said that while he was interrogating captured Nazis for his first investigation, he used an alias, Major Bill Orton. And I thought, what? Could they be one and the same person? I must ask Rena and see how she reacts. Perhaps she's been hiding some big secret for almost 80 years. So I went back to Rena in September 2023, not knowing that this would be the last time that I would see her, and that actually I would only ever meet her twice. But I asked her about Bill and Hugh and whether they were 1 or 2, and I paused. And she looked quite alarmed and said, "I don't believe it." She had an idea of who Hugh Trevor Roper was, and she knew that he was best friends, basically, with Bill Orton. And so that was proof enough for me that they were 2 different people. But neither of us had any idea why he might use that alias. I found out later that even the historians don't know. We both wanted to find out as much as each other, and Rena also wanted to work out why she and Marjorie had been given that task of translating the will, when, according to her, there were other, more senior translators available. All this funneled into the booklet, which as a result would get more substantial again. You see, it keeps growing, snowballing, if you like. And I went back home and went down some long historical rabbit holes, looking into the story of the alias, of Hitler's wills more generally, and trying to see if I could answer Rena's question. I had a lot of fun along the way, but it was a bit nerve-wracking because I'm not a historian, just somebody who's effectively stumbled into this. Nevertheless, I was determined to do my best. So I had questions for all sorts of people and different organisations, including actual historians, a vicar, a cricket club, and even MI5. I won't reveal what I found out today. You're going to have to read the book for that. But, sorry, I hope that Rena would feel proud of the effort that I went to. One other memorable moment with Rena was a musical interlude. So there I was in Rena's sitting room, asking her some clarifying questions about Bletchley Park, when all of a sudden she burst into song. You see, she'd suddenly remembered that she and the other 40 German bookroom women had made up a song about their time there. It was called The Swan Song of GBR, and it was sung to the tune of My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean. In it, the girls complained about the endless typing and wished for the war to be over. Rena didn't remember all of the words, but I was pretty impressed. We did just have to do a bit of la la la, but it was an absolutely delightful moment that I'll never forget. And I did think, wow, perhaps nobody else alive has heard this musical masterpiece. And so afterwards, straight away, I emailed the museum at Bletchley Park to tell them about it, and they said, yes, we know about that one. So I felt a bit embarrassed, but then eventually quite happy, because they revealed to me that Rena had actually donated a typed copy of the lyrics, which all the girls of the German bookroom had signed at the end of the war. It's dated 17th of May, 1945. So I added this to the book, which ended up containing all sorts of music and poetry, which I think would have pleased Rena. Later on, I asked the girls of a choir I'm part of to record a version of the song, just for fun. And we put on our best 1940s accents, and we were accompanied by an old-fashioned typewriter. So I now have a musical interlude for you. I hope you enjoy now a few verses of the Swan Song of GBR.
We wait with new hope for the dawn. Typing, typing, oh, for the end of the war. Typing, typing, we don't want to type anymore. Our section is 40 in number. We've maidens both tall and both short. They came from all corners of Britain. In GBR's net they were caught. Typing, typing, oh, for the end of the war. Typing, typing, we don't want to type anymore.
There we go. Thank you. So, another thing that I think Rena would be pleased about is that I looked into her Bletchley Park friends as well. Her friends were very important to her, I think all the more so because she never married or had children. And three were particular good friends, Agnes, Elma and Marjorie, also all Scotswomen and friends for life. I started looking into these three ladies while Rena was still alive, but sadly I didn't get a chance to tell her so. But anyway, in alphabetical order, let me introduce to you the friends. Friend number one was Agnes Gardner, also from Fife, whom Rena met on her first day at St Andrews. This was the friend that Rena signed up for war service with. They both agreed that they ought to do something about the war. And it was going to be Agnes and Rena versus Hitler, and of course the girls would triumph. Now, both had initially wanted to join the Wrens, the uniforms, of course, being far sexier. But sadly, there weren't any openings there at the time, so they were forced to join the ATS instead. Agnes went on to Bletchley Park with Rena, but didn't work in the German book room. The second friend was Elma Sunshine Morley from near Edinburgh, who'd studied at Edinburgh University. And she did work in the German book room in a side office with Rena. And the third friend, Marjorie Forbes. Marjorie Forbes was from Dundee and had studied at St Andrews, and she was the one that translated Hitler's will with Rena. Now, Agnes, Elma and Marjorie, as I said, all went on to Germany with Rena. And then after Germany, they all married and emigrated, but still, as I said, stayed friends for life. Don't they look lovely? Now, I thought that these three ladies' stories might help me to fill in some of the gaps in Rena's story, also that they were quite interesting in their own right, so I decided to track down their families. It was quite a challenge, but I managed it. Their families live all over the world now, and I hope maybe listening in today online, they've been very kind and contributed to the book, a mini biography of each of the three ladies, which now makes up part 2 of the book. Marjorie's son, Edmund, also contributed something extra. He sent me an entertaining letter that Marjorie had written during their time in Germany, talking about, among other things, the security situation there at the time. Because as I mentioned, there were real fears that the Nazis might try to win back power. And so the girls had to be escorted everywhere in the beginning by male soldiers. Now, Marjorie, nervous as to whether these soldiers were going to be up to the job or not, wrote about going down with the girls to do a recce of the man position. Now, I'm not sure if she was just thinking about security, but she sounds like she was good fun. So the pieces of the jigsaw were all starting to fall in place, but sadly, Rena wouldn't see it completed. I had assumed that I would have longer with her, but she died suddenly on the 11th of November 2023, only a few months after I first met her. But I did think that if you're a veteran, 11th of November is quite a good day to go. So she had a splendid send-off in Ealing and was conveyed up to Scotland, where she now rests in peace in London Links with her parents. I thought her life and death deserved to be noted, so I contacted her favourite newspapers, The Times and The Guardian. And I think she would have been delighted to know that she received a bumper obituary in both, and randomly also in some Italian newspapers. But that wasn't the end of it. You see, Rena had died before I had time to find out the identity of Major Bill Orton and to ask her 2 other questions. So I was left with 3 mysteries, which became part 3 of the book. The first mystery, which I've mentioned already, was who was Bill Orton? I couldn't work it out. Mystery number 2 was all about the location of the German book room at Bletchley Park. Historians do know which building it was located within, Block D here, which is now sadly derelict, but not where within it. And so I had a missing room to find, and I thought it was worthwhile looking into this because 40 women did work there for the war. Now, I received a site plan of the building, but only after Rena died, which was a shame because I could have just put it in front of her and she could have easily pointed out where she worked, although that would have been too easy. And then the third mystery is a question that I would have loved to ask Rena, which is, Rena, were you involved in helping to resolve the Cuban Missile Crisis while you worked at Caversham Park? You see, she had said something that had made me wonder. So all 3 investigations were great fun, took me all over the place again and to all sorts of people, including the museum at Bletchley Park, where the helpful historians really did help me. And I even sheepishly emailed MI5 and said, hello, I'm sure you're busy, but you don't happen to have a historian, do you? And waited. Again, I'm not going to say what I found. You're going to have to read the book, but I had a lot of fun in the process. And apart from these 3 investigations, one of the most interesting findings that I made, I guess, it happened when I was lucky enough to be able to look through Rena's possessions after she died. Now, Rena has one living relative, Stuart McLennan, sitting here today, and he gave me permission and has generally been extremely helpful with the book. So, off I went to Rena's house one last time. And one of the best bits was that I found, among all her old papers, an old leather photo album. Now, from the front, this didn't look like anything special, but on the inside, it was a treasure trove of secrets. Now, as I opened it, a bright red square of card fell out. It was the cut-out logo of a cigarette pack from the 1940s. And when I turned it over, hope you can see this at the back, on the back was a scribbled fake but funny cigarette certificate. This confirmed membership to the Sergeant's Mess at Bad Nendorf to one Sergeant McHaggis. So it seems that Rena had an alter ego, which possibly she took to the grave with her. I'm so glad that she saved this little scrap. I love it. Also in the album were lots and lots of photographs and other souvenirs from her time in Germany, including shocking photos of bomb-damaged cities. This is Hanover. A photo of Rena on what she described as an illegal trip to Berlin, standing outside Hitler's bunker. Postcards of beautiful old German towns, and then also lots of photographs of Rena and her friends looking a little bit tipsy at parties like naughty students. All the more secrets were revealed when I extracted each photo carefully from its little corner holders and found lots more scribbled notes on the back. Maybe nobody else ever saw these. One photograph was a part of a party, and on the back it said, "Drunk? Who, me?" But the funniest bit was that inexplicably there were lots of slightly surreptitious looking photos of young male soldiers. It seems that Rena was once again checking out the man position. And one photo in particular held quite a secret. It was a photograph of a smiling young man in British Army uniform standing in a garden. And when I turned it over, I found a love note to Rena. It said, "To Rena, the only reason I regret leaving the British Army of the Rhine, Frank." So, we know that Rena didn't get married, but she had no shortage of suitors. And at the end of the album was one final treasure, a heartfelt note from General Montgomery thanking the soldiers of the British Army of the Rhine for their service in the war, which I thought was quite lovely. Bit of history. Anyway, moving on, Rena had many loves, not just Frank. One of these was travelling, of which she did a tremendous amount, especially for her era and as a woman. She went everywhere from Moscow to Mexico, and after she died, I received 2 bonus pieces about her travels. One of these was a diary of her, what she described as her epic journey to Germany in 1945, by train, ferry to Ostend, and then train again through war-torn Europe. She described a couple of very jolly days at the beach in Ostend before a much less jolly part of the journey as they chugged along in their rickety train through the Netherlands and Germany and saw some rather unsettling sights, angry German prisoners of war and hungry children begging by the railway tracks. I was also sent 2 photographs of a holiday many years later, which Rena took with a BBC colleague, Margaret Wesley, in what is now Croatia. There was one photograph of her looking very much like a film star, and another photograph of her befriending a local donkey. The first photograph made the cut for the book, the second didn't. Never mind. And Rena had many other loves, including music. I was alerted to a YouTube video of her doing a version of a Desert Island Discs interview a few years back. One of these linked to a memory of Bletchley Park, which was of Rena and the girls absolutely freezing in their camp hut, huddled round a gramophone, listening to their very favourite song, La Mer by Charles Trenet, on repeat. This was the music that you heard at the start. So poetry, music, dancing and culture, anything Scottish in particular, Rena just loved it, and I've tried to make this shine throughout the book. It's also why, for the people in the room today, at the book signing later, I'll be giving away some lovely free Walker's shortbread. One of her loves was Scottish food, and the company very kindly donated some for the audience today, and sorry to the people online. Anyway, I tried to make this not so much a dry history, but as interesting and entertaining as Rena herself was, albeit covering some difficult topics. But I think that's what Rena herself was like. She was very fun, but she combined this with being a very serious and determined character as well, especially when it came to her career. She was set on becoming a journalist, even as a schoolgirl. She had noticed what life was like for her mother's generation, and that most women didn't have the option of a career in those days, or maybe became teachers until they got married. Rena didn't want that for herself. She wanted to really make something of herself, and in fact she said she'd rather scrub floors. But even when she did get into her career and into the media, it wasn't easy being female. Nevertheless, she persisted. One of her junior female colleagues complimented her, I guess you could say, on her winning combination of a gentle smile and a will of iron. This was a lady called Sally Ann Thomas, who wrote one of the two forwards for the book, but sadly died last summer. And Sally Ann said of Rena was a leading light for a lot of us. My generation of women journalists realised that the more senior jobs were not beyond their reach. And on that note, I won't reach further into Rena's story, but instead I'm going to move on to the terrific tale of Hitler's two wills, the big story within the story. I'm going to tell you a bit about the wills, up until the point at which they landed on Rena and Marjorie's desk. I find it quite astonishing. This is a story the general public doesn't know about yet, but I think they should. Now, it's quite complicated. It took me a long time to wrap my head around it, as you can see from this mind map I attempted to draw. But I did unravel the story in the end, and I'm quite excited to tell people about it now. So here is the untangled lowdown on the wills. So, on April 29th, 1945, the Red Army was closing in on the centre of Berlin. Down in his bunker, Hitler knew he was finished, but for some reason he still thought that there was a chance for the Nazi movement. So he had appointed a successor, Grand Admiral Dönitz, who was at that point head of the Navy. Then, 24 hours before he committed suicide, Hitler dictated two wills, a political one and a personal one. The political will was vile, and it blamed the Jews for the war. The personal one was much more run-of-the-mill, and that was the one that Rena and Marjorie would translate, albeit very carefully. Hitler had 3 copies of the wills made and gave them to trusted messengers. Their mission was to escape and take the documents to safety. The 3 messengers were Heinz Lorenz, who was Hitler's deputy chief press secretary, SS Colonel Wilhelm Zander, some good German names here, personal advisor to Martin Bormann, who was Hitler's private secretary, and then thirdly, Major Willy Johannmeier, Hitler's army adjutant. Their escape story away from the Red Army and over to the West is quite dramatic. So first of all, they had to escape from Hitler's bunker and get out of Berlin alive under heavy bombardment by the Russians. But they managed to do so, and then had to stay overnight with a battalion of Hitler Youth, mainly teenage boys, most of whom would die under Russian bombardment. They then requisitioned 2 boats and started floating down the River Havel towards the west. At a certain point, they stopped and radioed Admiral Dönitz to request a rescue plane. They then moored up on a little island in the middle of the river to await the plane's arrival. However, then the Russians arrived and started bombing the island, so they had to requisition 2 more boats, this time a canoe and a yacht, and sail away from the island a little bit to wait for the plane. Now, the plane did finally arrive. It was a seaplane, but at the last minute, one of the messenger's boats almost capsized, and in the chaos, and with the Russians now trying to shoot down the plane as well, the plane was forced to fly off without them. So the messengers had no choice but to carry on. and they managed to get over 100 kilometres away from Berlin, then disguised themselves as foreign workers and entered the safe zone. But then they heard news that Admiral Dönitz had surrendered and the war was over, so they had to abandon their mission. Instead, they split up and hid their documents, but they weren't counting on Hugh Trevor Roper. Now, Trevor Roper, a few months later, was to complete his investigation into Hitler's fate, quashing rumours that, among other things, he'd escaped on a submarine to Argentina or was living in Berlin dressed as a woman. So he sorted this out and then moved on to the question of the wills. Now, the Allies knew about the wills and the copies because a telegram had been found at the end of the war which mentioned these. The problem for the three messengers in hiding, however, was that they weren't very good at hiding. So, in November 1945, Heinz Lorenz was the first of the three to be found. He had moved to Luxembourg, changed his name to Georges Thiers, and become a journalist. But he was arrested for the simple crime of carrying false identity papers. Now, he might have gotten away with it, if not for a guard who manhandled him because he was moving along too slowly and felt a strange bulk in the jacket of the shoulder of his jacket. And inside, the guard found the original wills and an appendix by Goebbels. Lorenz caved in quite quickly and revealed all, including the names of the two other messengers. Next to be found was Willy Johannmeier, who'd been a little bit silly, and silly Billy, and chosen as his hiding place, his parents' house. However, Johannmeier was a battle-hardened soldier, and he was much less willing to give any information away. So Trevor Roper put him into solitary confinement while he looked for the third messenger, Wilhelm Zander. Now, it was by this time Christmas 1945, and soon, thanks to the Americans, actually, a lead was found on Zander. Like Lorenz, he had also changed his name and job title, and it took Trevor Roper a while to track down Herr Postin, the market gardener. But eventually he found him. This was in the middle of the night on the 28th of December in a remote farmhouse on the Austrian border. Hugh Trevor Roper stationed armed guards at each corner of the building and told a German policeman to enter through a window. Inside, they found Zander in bed with a woman who was not his wife. Zander denied his identity, but then was taken for interrogation and quickly folded. Shortly afterwards, his set of the documents were found in a suitcase at the home of the woman's sister. Now, once Johannmeier realised that the other two had been so quick to confess, he finally did so too. Trevor Roper drove him to his parents' house, and again it was a dark night. Johannmeier and Trevor Roper were standing in the garden when Johannmeier picked up an axe. This must have briefly concerned Hugh Trevor Roper. But luckily, he used it to break the icy ground and to smash a bottle in which he had hidden his set of the documents. So finally, all three sets were recovered. And not long afterwards, Rena and Marjorie would be given their special task, and Trevor Roper would go home to Oxford University to begin a new and much less dramatic job as a historian. This would be also the time when he would start to write The Last Days of Hitler. So that's the story of Hitler's wills in a nutshell. There's lots more to it, and lots more to Trevor Roper also. But I just love this story, and I think it would make a great movie, especially if it focused on the interesting character of Hugh Trevor Roper. Although, of course, Rena and Marjorie would need to feature, played by some very glamorous actresses. So, when Rena died, she wasn't yet a person of note. But as mentioned, I thought that she deserved to be noted and remembered. I think Rena gave us an excellent example of what an ordinary person can do if they have a good dose of determination, community spirit, and humour. Plus, she inadvertently brought the story of Hitler's wills to light, so I expect she'll be happy about that. Overall, I hope that she'll feel proud of herself, and I hope that her friends will also feel proud of themselves. But Rena's story seems to be a never-ending one, because I still have lots of questions that I haven't resolved or that keep popping up. For example, who was this lovely Frank? And is there more to find out about Bill Orton? Also, could I track down some of the other families of the people that she mentions in her story or that are scribbled on the back of photographs in her album? I'm sure they'd like to know. So I'm quite excited about what more can be added to the jigsaw of Rena. So watch this space. But for now, I want to say thank you to Rena, to the friends and families, and all of those who have helped me on this exciting project. I'd also like to thank the National Army Museum for hosting me on my launch day. I'm really grateful. And also to Walker's Shortbread for their kind donation, which will make sure nobody starves today. Happy to sign books afterwards, and a blether over Strupak in the cafe. But in the meantime, does anyone have any questions?
La mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs a des reflets d'argent. La mer, des reflets changeants sous la pluie. La mer au ciel d'été confond ses blancs moutons avec les anges si purs. La mer, bergère d'azur infinie. Voyez, près des étangs, ces grands roseaux mouillés. Voyez, ces oiseaux blancs et ces maisons rouillées. La mer les a bercés le long des golfes clairs et d'une chanson d'amour. La mer a bercé mon cœur pour la vie. La mer qu'on voit danser le long des golfes clairs a des reflets d'argent. La mer, des reflets changeants sous la pluie. La mer au ciel d'été confond ces blancs moutons avec les anges si purs. La mer, bergère d'azur infinie. Voyez, près des étangs, ces grands roseaux mouillés. Voyez, ces oiseaux blancs et ces maisons rouillées. La mer, elle les a bercés le long des golfes clairs et d'une chanson d'amour. La mer a bercé mon cœur pour la vie.